Welcome back. We are having our discussions with Professor Prabhat Patnaik on the global economic crisis. This section, Prabhat, we're going to discuss what is its impact on India. Now, a lot of people have said that it was the left which prevented the coupling of the global financial markets and Indian financial institutions in that sense. Do you think that has really averted in some sense the deepening of the crisis in India?
Oh, absolutely. It has prevented the financial crisis hitting India. I think the total foreign assets of Indian banks as a proportion of their assets is about less than 7%. And within that, of course, toxic assets would be virtually negligible. So in a certain sense, the Indian banks have been saved from the impact of the financial crisis because of the insularity which has been imposed upon them by the left's position. But on the other hand, even though they have been saved from the financial crisis, but nonetheless the real crisis of the world economy is going to affect them, because after all India is an export-oriented economy. Its impact on India is not as severe, likely to be as severe as its impact on China, which used to be much more export dependent. But on the other hand, even on India, there is an impact which we know. It's in sectors like textiles and so on, which are really major exporting activities.
The textiles is one, of course, a manufacturing sector which has been hit. But apart from textiles, the other sector which has really been hit is the services sector, particularly the IT sector.
Yes.
Now, of course, one can discuss what's the relation of the IT sector to the larger Indian economy, because it remains in some sense and also insulated from the rest of the economy, except putting some money into the economy, but it really doesn't drive the demand directly.
Yes.
But if you really look at it, the services sector is going to be affected by the crisis. The second is a lot of the inward remittances, the foreign exchange situation could really get worse.
Yes.
And if you say the third thing that you did, that the commodity pricing could get into an inflationary cycle middle of next year, which is what some of the people are predicting it will, then we could have another serious foreign exchange crisis in our hands.
You see, commodities, at the moment commodity prices are falling. Commodity markets function peculiarly, because when commodity prices fall, they are passed on to the growers, and when commodity prices rise, the middlemen have the profits. So I think the commodity price movements are on the whole going to be damaging for the Indian economy, because when the prices rise, this is going to affect consumers. When the prices fall, like now, it's not it's not something which is benefiting consumers in any way. In fact, the inflation of the 2008 period is something which may have come to an end, but the high level of prices reached is continuing. If anything, prices are still rising for a variety of other commodities. So you get the situation that the commodity price movements are going to hurt us. You are absolutely right that the service sector exports are going to hurt us. And I think they are going to hurt us partly also because the United States is likely to go much more protectionist. I think despite the fiscal stimulus packages which Obama has announced, which are a follow-up on the Bush administration's packages, the US economy is still not doing well. I mean, I think what you now can say at the most, and even that is doubtful, is that the increase in unemployment is coming down from month to month, but even that is not certain, because in June the increase in unemployment was higher than in May. In July it has come down a little bit compared to June. So, but unemployment itself is still increasing. Now, already there is a lot of opposition to even the fiscal deficits and the fiscal packages that Obama has announced. It will be difficult for him to continue with this for a second year in succession. And if he withdraws, then of course the economy would move back into a recession. Therefore, Obama would be tempted to go in for greater protectionism to make sure that the impact of the fiscal packages on US employment is much greater than is the case now, particularly because these packages can't be carried on ad infinitum. Now, if that is the case, then that's going to affect some of our exports, in particular service sector exports of the kind that you are talking about. But I think even though the service sector exports may not have much of a direct economic impact, they'll have a very substantial impact in terms of consciousness, in terms of their political implications and so on.
The Shining India is going to
That's
be
right, exactly.
more badly affected,
Yes,
even if it doesn't
absolutely.
mean so much impact on the real economy.
Exactly, yes.
But that brings me back to the question. The government of India seems to feel that if the stock market is reasonably happy, if the Shining India is reasonably happy, there is really no crisis. But if you really look at what is happening, our manufacturing sector is certainly not expanding. There is a crisis of textiles, as you said. So in that sense, the underlying crisis in the Indian economy is actually quite severe, which is not being at the moment addressed.
Yes, I think this whole perception that if the stock market does well, then the rest of the economy must be doing well is a completely wrong perception. It used to be said in America, what's good for Wall Street is good for Main Street, but I think that's a completely wrong perception. A point which we were discussing a bit earlier is this, that you see when the stock market or the financial markets collapse, they certainly have a deep impact on the real economy. When the financial markets recover, they do not necessarily have an impact by way of recovering the real economy. So there's an asymmetric impact of the financial markets on the real economy. So in the US again, the stock markets now are in fact, recovering, rallying. The financial sector now has stabilized, but this has not meant that the real economy is improving. And exactly the same is true of India, because I think, the impact of the stock market recovery is something which is quite minuscule when it comes to the real economy.
So what do you think the government of India should do in order to stimulate the manufacturing part of the economy, agriculture, which are really the two major employment generation potential?
The government of India is, if you talk to the government of India, they say that we are actually having a very substantial fiscal stimulus and so on. But I think there's a problem there. You see, when your revenues fall, then even assuming you're just balancing your budget, your expenditure falls. Okay. Now, there is a counter-cyclical expansion in expenditure you can have to keep it at the old level. But that is not a stimulus. That is just preventing. That's just
Further
preventing.
slide.
Yeah. So one should distinguish between the fiscal stimulus proper and the counter-cyclical fiscal expenditure, if you like. And what appears to be a very substantial fiscal stimulus in India is really not all that fiscally substantial, because it combines both these. The net, by the way, the same is true of the United States. In fact, many people have argued that in the United States, the net fiscal stimulus is close to zero, because the state governments are not allowed to have any fiscal deficit. Arnold Schwarzenegger is having problems in California and so on, because when the state government's revenue goes down, their expenditures must go down. The federal government can run a fiscal deficit. Now, a lot of the federal government's fiscal deficit is for sustaining the financial sector, but that is not actually expenditure. People argue that the expenditure of the federal government is something which just about offsets the reduced expenditure of the state government. So the net fiscal deficit is zero, net fiscal stimulus is zero. Much the same way in India, the net fiscal stimulus is not very substantial, even though it appears that the fiscal deficit is quite large. So I think the government really has to enlarge the fiscal stimulus proper. And I think do so in areas which would actually be of benefit to the ordinary common people, because then they would be able to spend a lot more on all kinds of relatively simple commodities which are very employment intensive, so that the impact of the crisis can be blunted. You just see what the Chinese are doing. The Chinese are having a very substantial expansion of their fiscal deficit, 7% of GDP per year over a 2-year period, and a lot of it is actually being spent in the agricultural sector. in various ways, dovetailing it into that socialist countryside plan that the CPC had announced some time ago. So I think that is the way that we should also be going.
Thanks a lot, Prabhat. I think it's been a very interesting discussion. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.